And we're live. Hello, everyone. We're having a great time leading up to this broadcast because there have been so many interesting kind of funky issues around it. But we have Alexandra Bruce from Forbidden Knowledge TV with us. Hi, Alexandra.
Howdy-hi.
It's great to have you because as we go through this, that kind of continuity of the kind of journalism that you do really makes a big difference. And I think, when I go after these issues, I'm so deep into the research behind it and all the things that are happening with the new releases and how the CIA is blocking the information from coming out and how the FBI is, giving us these 200 documents that they already gave us. But hey, it looks like a new big surprise because the letterhead, you can see that now. So, but it is interesting because when you dealing with these stories and going through this stuff on a regular basis, you see this kind of subterfuge and suppression going on all the time when you're doing this kind of media observation and posting your videos at Forbidden Knowledge TV. And one of the things that I'm noticing is in the first couple of weeks when this was coming out about the JFK 2017 files, which we're going to cover a lot tonight and really go deep on this, because as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to be on Coast to Coast AM tonight with Linda Moulton Howe. We're going to really get into this and see what's been going on, and also try to get a picture of what the holdup is on these records after 54 years when they're by law mandated to be out last October 26th. So we're almost a month out, and we've got less than 20% of the files. And what we're getting, it's interesting actually, because our friend Julian Assange over there was saying, this is no kind of release. Like, they really should be ashamed because you get these releases and the whole page is completely whited out. And so it's kind of the caricature of what we would expect.
Well, a lot of the things are just completely not right.
Yeah, that's right.
And so Trump gave them, what, another 90 days or more? Six months.
It is, yeah. It's all the way for 180 days.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of fascinating because when we look at it, it's absurd, right? Everyone who's a responsible researcher in the area and understands what's involved is saying they've had 25 years to prepare for this moment. And interestingly enough, one of the articles that I read, it was on Who, What, Why, which I think does a lot of really good, because there are people in there who kind of freelance for them. And you'll see an article from like Dick Russell, who I've done an extensive interview with, but he wrote one of the best books on the JFK assassination, which was The Man Who Knew Too Much. And it's pretty interesting about Richard Case Nagel, who was kind of like the other Oswald, this other guy that they grabbed out of an orphanage and gave a background to. And one of the jobs that they gave him was to mirror Oswald. And that's a very fascinating story. But these people have been really involved with it. And Russell, when he was a newspaper guy in the 70s and 80s, he was tracking through this, and he met with James Jesus Angleton and these CIA people, so he knew the gig really well. And so when he comes out and says that they're really, at this point, the thing that they're pushing, which is the whole Mexico City narrative about Oswald and the KGB, and there's no evidence that Oswald was even there, I find it even more interesting because these people are looking at it. They fought these battles in the 70s and 80s. And here we are, it's supposed to be kind of, period of enlightenment, looking back in the stuff 50 years later. And the censorship is worse than ever.
Oh, absolutely. In the age where information is everywhere, there are no, they could have done this stuff, all of it in the 70s, and it wouldn't have had the kind of impact that it can have today.
Right.
Because of the internet, basically, and social media.
Well, the internet's already unearthed a lot of this information. So it's a good point that you're making there. But we're also looking at files, and the media is being like, it could have been that Oswald went to Mexico City. I mean, that's such the nothing part of the story. The big key is that at that time, the story was suppressed, and the CIA got away with portraying themselves as out of the loop and not giving the Warren Commission information and having Alan Dulles there, who Kennedy had fired, and all that kind of thing. And the idea on the surface for the official story is just that there's nothing to see here. Well, we all know that that's not true. And even 70% of Americans don't accept the official verdict. So since we all know anyway, what's the point? But they have to hold on to that secret hardcore, because if that secret opens up, then other things start to open up and we get into these deeper issues. And this is the kind of thing that they're trying to prevent. Now, one of the major releases that did come out was this story, and I think this is significant, even though these releases are not really chock full of the kind of things that we were hoping for. And because they're so, redacted. But a few of the things that came out are pretty fascinating, actually. One of them, which I think is significant, is that they have an FBI informant who was working. For some reason, the FBI was keeping an eye on Jack Ruby at the time. Now, we know Ruby was involved in drug running and prostitution, so that's probably what it was. But in any case, the informant came back and said that he invited him to watch the fireworks in Dealey Plaza the day of the assassination.
Pretty interesting.
Yes. That has to be, we're getting these little confirmations, just like as we got in the newspaper beforehand in the UK that got the word 25 minutes before the assassination happened that called the US Embassy that something big is going down in America. Well, there's a lot of foreknowledge that's coming to the surface that we're seeing. And in the case of Ruby, who's so closely associated with the whole thing, assassinating Oswald a few days later, that's huge, I think, because it shows foreknowledge on Ruby's part.
Absolutely.
So what do you do with something like that? You're starting to get into an area or a situation where, you realize
that came out, that they just miss it.
No, I'm sure it's the kind of thing they held back on purpose, but
now they're letting it. Why? I mean, these are the kinds of questions.
How did it slip through, you mean? Yeah.
How did it slip through before? Did they just not catch it, or are they letting it out? I mean, and why?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I think can happen in all these releases, because it's such a flood of detail, that I think there are little things that they keep in there on purpose, like, ooh, did Oswald go to Mexico City? Or, was he a KGB agent? That type of fluff, or was Castro behind him? And this kind of thing. So they want to give that version of history. And they have these kind of mouthpiece guys out there, like New York Times bestselling author Gerald Posner and Philip Shannon, these guys. And the kind of work that they're doing all has to do with this discredited notion of Oswald as some kind of foreign agent. And that's their backup plan in case all their materials stumbles out and people find out that Oswald wasn't a lone nut, that the FBI tracked him since 1960, that the head of the FBI, Hoover, was tracking him in 1960, 3 years before the assassination himself. So James, actually, it's interesting because this is a whole interesting thing that's going on right now, because Jefferson Morley is a former Washington Post reporter, and he's been tracking the story pretty interestingly, but he's got his eye just on what the CIA knew. That is, he's not getting into the nitty-gritty of whether Oswald was a CIA agent or a CIA asset. I think it's plainly clear that he was. But one of the things that we see Morley doing is he's getting into this whole play about what the CIA knew. And he now has this information that the assistant to Angleton prepared a file on Oswald in 1959, because he's done all these lawsuits and everything else trying to get information from the CIA about some of the operatives that he's uncovered.
Wow, that's 1959. That's a long time.
It is. It's 4 years before the assassination, and it's when he defected to the Soviet Union. It makes sense. Of course, they were following him. Question is, for anybody who's still clinging to the official version, why would they follow him and then not own up to it? And the obvious conclusion is that they were using him as some kind of an asset in some kind of a game around intelligence and counterintelligence. And at the last minute, his role gets exposed, that he's the patsy for the whole thing. And he's a great setup because, as we know, he has a right-wing background in real life, but they portray him as this weird left-winger. And they carefully craft his image, I think, as this nut, as this kind of communist loose cannon going to the Soviet Union and all the rest of it. And it's funny because they have Larry Sabato, who's this kind of you know, mainstream historian type guy that would show up on PBS talking about this, and he's like, you know, oh, you had to be crazy to go to the Soviet Union in those days, you know, and the CIA didn't want to expose their own role in, you know, observing Oswald and like, you know, not keeping a closer eye on this crazy guy. I mean, it's real. It's gotten that bad. And this is fascinating, I think, because we're going into this area of complete denial. And, you know, this has to be, along with all of the things that we're seeing around the media, this sort of almost nervous breakdown, you know.
Yeah, I think that basically everything that the internet is and has spawned, like social media and basically citizen journalism, is it's so antithetical to the culture, to the clandestine culture of the CIA and the sham of what the mainstream media is, which is just propaganda managed by the CIA to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
And so these hairsprayed, smiley face people telling you what reality is, it just doesn't really work as well anymore. It doesn't work for me. I think for an increasing amount of people, it's like, why are you going to listen to these hairspray people getting paid $30 million a year to tell you some, you know, lies that were scripted for them? You know, they're not journalists by any stretch. Why are we listening to them? Why does anyone watch them?
I can see that hairspraypeople.com is going to become a hot domain as we get off here. It's interesting, though. I mean, I think that they had a kind of a position in the culture, you know, with the media at a certain point, and they really advocated it. And the 2016 election was one of the worst examples in history about that. But recently we saw that the RT guy, and, you know, whatever you want to say about RT, if you think that they have an agenda for the Russian government, all right. But their journalism is top notch. And when they start talking about reality versus the reality that, you know, we get in like Newsweek or the Washington Post, I mean, the difference is so dramatic. But they're making the head of RT register as a foreign agent. I mean, how do you feel about something like that? Here you are doing ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, reporting on all this stuff that people can't get access to. You know, what do you think when you see something like that?
Well, it's, you know, I think it really reveals, it unmasks what American freedom of press is all about. I mean, you know, our mainstream media is controlled. It's every, you know, high level person, you know, there is basically owned or part of the security state, and the narratives that are allowed to be broadcast are the narrative that are approved. And what you get from RT and from me and other people in the alternative media is an alternative narrative. And what RT does is it just, because it's so much higher quality, their journalism, it just really shows up the mainstream horribly, you know.
There's no question.
It's a really bad look. And what I find fascinating also about RT is that, you know, they broadcast in English, obviously. It's a Russian state news agency. But English is probably the most broadly spoken language in the world. And so that's why they do it instead of in Russian. And their headquarters for the longest time, until maybe 2 years ago, was London. But then the British government closed, you know, warned them, said that we're not going to allow you to bank in the UK anymore.
Wow. So, right, that's the thing.
I don't think that they ever followed up. I mean, they did a few stories. They had their editor-in-chief, I'm forgetting her name, do a segment on it, and several of the reporters did segments on it, but they really never followed up about where they moved their headquarters. What I do notice is that Max Kaiser broadcasts out of New York now instead of London, which he did do for years. So I don't know if they moved their headquarters to
right. That's right. That's what's been happening.
But I mean, in my case, there was one, I had an incident way back in 2011 where my newsletter service, the mass mailing company that's probably the most expensive part of running my website, deleted my account that has all my lists, has all my subscribers and all of that. They simply deleted my account without any warning. And when I called them, they said, "You've been spamming." I said, "No, I haven't." And they finally, she broke down and she said, one of the 3 top ISPs has told me that if we don't delete your account, that they will block all of the traffic from all of our other clients.
Whoa.
And I said, "Well, who is it?" She says, "Well, it's confidentiality. I can't tell you." And I said, "What was the subject line?" And it was the one about smart meters. And when I looked at the thing, the actual email, it had the language, it had legal language for rolling back the implementation of smart meters, which were being rolled out in 2011 all over the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. In fact, that's why I ran the store, because that morning I'd gotten a knock on the door saying, you know, your smart meter's been installed, and when I was living in Los Angeles at the time. So, yeah, that they could, luckily I had backed up my list 4 days before, and I was able to reconstruct with confirmations the 800 new subscribers that I had in 4 days. My website was growing like crazy back then.
Wow. Wow. Well, you always have that, it seems like a lot of the breaking news, I feel like your site drives a lot of that. And it is fascinating, though. I do feel like there was a point last year when you were covering a lot of the Hillary campaign where things seemed like you were having a rougher time than usual technologically. And I felt, because of the amount of anti-Hillary stories that you were doing, that you were really being technologically messed with at that point.
I've had all kinds of weirdness. There's so much, I guess, involved with with the internet that so many things can go wrong, I guess. And yeah, it's been strange, and sometimes I just kind of don't want to do it anymore, frankly.
Well, this is the interesting thing, and this is about really what are the crossroads that you hit when you're a real journalist versus being in that pampered environment, I think, that you were talking about.
Yeah.
But I do feel that it's crucial to be able to do the work that you do without being interfered with. And, I think about a lot of these journalists that we're talking about who covered the JFK assassination, who come back now, and they are people who were around, so let's say in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, really following the story. And they come back and they can see the difference in the journalistic quality of what was happening. Because, of course, in a period like the 70s, you had incredible, like FOIA requests became very popular. And you had this whole openness where we understood that the CIA was manipulating the media. And you get into these later periods, it gets very murky, because there's a period after 9/11 where almost all the people that are guests or consultants on CNN are some kind of a general, or they're from an ex-CIA or whatever. So they really bring that in. And we know that having that close link with the CIA can really make or break a journalistic career in those circles. And it's kind of a really major problem, because these are the people you're supposed to be covering. And when you bring it down to that level, then I think we're in for a real hard time when you're a mainstream journalist trying to do that. It only makes sense for someone like me to take a look at it and say, you're not going to get very far telling the truth on that. It's the nature of the beast. If you really want to get outside of those circles, you have to go independent. And we're seeing that with a lot of people. I think the only thing that we need now is that more of the kind of investigatory resources need to be with the alternative media. Now I've seen, some Reddit threads that are better than a regular report.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No comparison. In fact, that's hopefully it'll start sinking into people that other stuff, the stuff CNN and whatever, is just, that's some weird like entertainment / propaganda BS that is a waste of your time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's no question. There's no question. But I do feel like, again, when we come up to this JFK release, we're encountering that problem, because we've got the records. They're supposed to be released on the 22nd. The government blocks it. Should be a major story on the side of the mainstream media, but it isn't. All they can say is, oh, look at this thing, you know, MLK had an extramarital affair, right? This is where they want you to look. And as we're looking at all the weird sex scandals, you know, we have these major sex scandals around media figures like Charlie Rose. We're just looking at an incredible situation, but that stuff on balance, you know, with the weight of the fact that we have a government condition from over 50 years ago that was never actually remedied and that we were never able to look at. And that's kind of the root of a lot of the secrecy. And then you realize secrecy goes on in all of these different areas, you know, whether it has to do with dealing with these drug lords and gun running and things like that, or if we get into other areas, you know, when we're looking at Enron and all the rest of it, these things were allowed to exist. Even Bernie Madoff was allowed to exist. And I think what it comes down to is it's the secrecy factor, that you need a mechanism for breaking through the secrecy. And the idea is it should be the media, but instead the media is largely a tool of the entertainment fields, and of course, largely a tool of the government itself.
Absolutely. And somebody sent me a link of a Dick Cavett show. It was actually Raquel Welch and I'm forgetting a great woman singer. It was like the least likely encounter ever, but just the quality. And I thought he was a nothing at the, you know, when I was a little kid and I would see old reruns of him. But the quality, the intellectual quality that was still present in pop culture. And even Raquel Welch sounded like a rocket scientist compared to anyone on television today. Mm-hmm. It's just the incredible dumbing down that has happened in the past, you know, 3 decades, 4 decades. It's shocking.
It is. It's disturbing. It is incredibly disturbing. I know they're so politically informed coming out of the 60s into the 70s. Mm-hmm. And then you have this 80s kind of money period. But I think because there's so much anti-nuclear activism, there's still an activist spirit. There's still a tendency for getting at the truth. And by the 90s, you really have something going because you're opening up the UFO topic in a big way. This is huge.
And then, you know, hip hop was a social revolution that was televised.
Right.
And now basically everyone talks like a rapper. You know,
including me, right? Let's face it. I do think it's interesting though, because where we're heading, you know, we're going into 2018, right? The government just fell down and giving out these records from 54 years ago. We'll start there, right? Then we've got the UFO issue, which is a complete smokescreen now. We have so many real reports about UFOs. We have such a history around UFOs, 70 years now, at least. And so we have this kind of dynamic situation, and the culture can't move. It can't move into these areas because it can't find out about what happened with the JFK assassination. It can't find out what the CIA was up to over 50 years ago. It can't find out the root of the UFO matter. I mean, all of these things are, they're trying to make them into these untouchable subjects or as entertainment factors. And it's really, I mean, it's a large-scale cover-up, but if you don't have a media to report on it, if they're more interested in Al Franken's sex life, then, you know, and I mean, those people should be exposed, but, you know.
I think it's a little overmuch. I mean, I agree. And yeah, that it's sort of happening. Okay, fine. Let just pop the giant zit of, you know, sexual been happening for millennia. Great. But
true.
I do think it's a little fascistic, and, you know, like it's got to stop at some point. You know, let it all out. Fine, great, but, you know, then everybody stop it. Then know that you can't behave like that, and just stop it and move on. But I think that a lot of it's about controlling the information that has, you know, about alternate technologies and just, you know, power at the end of the day. Who's really controlling the flow of information, how the economy works, and the energy economy in specific. That's really kind of where the secrecy is really, you know, that's where the secrecy is occurring.
There's no question about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into a part 2 and break down the secrecy aspects, where it comes from, why we're in this kind of a situation, and how real journalism can penetrate through this. I'm going to go through a few more of these revelations around the JFK records release for 2017. And we're also going to talk about a very exciting project that you and I are both a part of that is going to be out fairly soon. And we're going to do all this, and fingers crossed, we're going to have Susan Manewich from New Energy Movement to join us. So everyone in chat, come back to the channel in about 10 minutes. We're going to end this broadcast, and we're going to come back on with Susan Manewich and Alexandra Bruce and go deep, deep, deep on the new records release. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon. Bye, Alexandra. But Alexandra, you stick around.
Okay, I'm going to take a pee break.